The cybersecurity job interview is a critical piece of the puzzle in getting your job in cybersecurity. In this week's episode, we are continuing our 6-part series with Stefan Samaroth, where we're going to be really diving deep into the interview, what you need to know to crush it, and what you need to do before you even walk through the door. Coming up. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Be sure to subscribe. We've got a bunch of live streams coming up for the month of October. I can't wait. I'm super excited and I don't want you to miss it. We are continuing the 6-part series with episode 3 today, all about the interview. Now, we've been walking through the kind of career journey of breaking into cybersecurity. So episodes 1 and 2 was finding the job and getting the resume. So if you need help with that, go check those episodes out. But now we're assuming that that resume has got you the interview and now you need to crush it, right? So we're going to jump into the interview here with Stefan, but what I really want to call your attention to is there's a lot of preparation that goes in to the interview. So when you get there, you are confident, you feel good about yourself, you know how you're going to respond to certain questions that you can totally expect to be asked. And more importantly, and this is a key takeaway a lot of people who are new can miss, you are also interviewing them. You're interviewing them for their culture, for their expectations of you, for, why does the job even exist in the first place, and making sure that it's a good fit. The interview should be a two-way street, and I really want you to kind of wrap your head around that, okay? Now, really quick, if you're new here, I'm Jerry Ozier. This is Simply Cyber, the YouTube channel designed to help you make and take a cybersecurity career further faster. And on this channel, we do labs and deep tech stuff, but right now what we're doing is helping you get that job in cybersecurity. So let's jump into episode 3. I hope you enjoy it. We've gotten through the application process. They like what they see, and we're going to sit down for the interview. So let's talk all about best practices for the cybersecurity interview. Before we even get to the interview and sit down and start talking to the hiring manager, what are we doing, Stefan?
Okay, so there's actually a lot to this, and the way that I approach it is as I would a consultant coming into an organization before I get before I literally even walk in, like with my binder of notes that are ready to go. The classic old pitch of, "Wow, he really did his homework." So
Mm-hmm.
what does that homework mean? There's a lot to know, and you don't have to know all of it right off the top of the head. And as you go further in your career, it'll start to become second nature. And especially when you're in one industry or in one role across industries, it ends up kind of being similar. So the question becomes like, are you a musician or are you a jazz artist, and how much can you actually free flow through this versus doing the prep now? So I like to consider myself, no matter what position I'm going for, to be a novice for that. And I'm going to prepare myself as if I don't know anything about a company. And I call that due diligence.
Mm-hmm.
So part of that due diligence is knowing what is the mission of the company.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I don't know how the company is going to generate revenue, I can't know or understand how my position in that company helps drive revenue for the company or save bottom line, because it's two things.
Yeah.
So
So how are you finding out that mission? I mean, I feel like 99% of people are just going to Google the company's name and go to the About Us page.
that and actually that is a great place to start. That is really it honestly is a great place to start. Most companies aren't going to have it there. But if you don't see it there, then you go to the next steps. If they're a public company, one of my favorite places to go is to the IRS repository and look at their quarterly earnings statement. What does their 10K and other statements say about them? And because those will list out the legitimate risks to the company line by line by line. And if you're coming in to solve one of those risks, it's right there and you can talk about it. So, years ago when I was interviewing for a couple big name security companies that you all know, heard of, maybe love, I did absolutely that. And I brought it up in one of the discussions, and the gentleman on the other side of the table goes, "Oh, good. You read that." Like it was an expectation that
Yeah.
I was supposed to. I thought I was being advanced. And he goes, "Oh, nope, that's expected." So that preparation. So we've got this idea of what is the revenue for the company? How is the company doing that? Vision, mission, values. And if you know, the vast majority of the people like you, Doc, that you mentor and I mentor, the vast majority of them are introverts,
Hmm.
like me. And I'm not going to throw that title at you, but I certainly am. So the next step out of that is after we've done, the paperwork homework of what does that look like, going and talking to other people. So after you've been in the industry for a while, you'll start having some connections,
Hmm.
and you call up your friend that maybe just left or has been there for a while, and you say, "Okay, so really, like, what's the deal here?" And you get the laydown, and that's a great way to go. But who are the clients? Who are some
Hmm.
of the suppliers? Like that business level stuff, because you don't necessarily need to know and operate in that context every day. It should be in the back of your mind. But if you know that your potential employer does work in a region that you know the language of, whether it's a selling point or not, it's something that you can bring up and you can get a head nod.
Hmm.
That's a great thing to do. Knowing basically the salary band, if possible. They're not always published. Like Colorado just published a law. And I'm not a lawyer; it's not legal advice that says as you publish job positions, you have to publish the salary range. That is a major cultural shift, especially in security.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But it's awesome. I'm glad they're doing it. Public sector's been doing that forever, for
Mhm.
good reason, right? Transparency. But no, I'm glad that they're doing that. I hadn't heard about that, but I agree 100% of doing some research, understanding not just what the job is that you're going to do, but what the mission is. If you could get that pay band, that would be awesome. But uh, as important. So like what you're talking about resonates with any job, right? Not just a
Mhm.
cybersecurity job. Any job that you're going to, you want to look like you're invested, right? Like you care about it and you're doing what you're supposed to do to edge out yourself as a better candidate. So I,
Well,
I think that those.
it's not even showing that you are invested. It's also proving to yourself that you're invested.
Mhm. Yeah. And I could, we'll get into this a little bit later, about red flags and stuff like that. But your research might actually discover something that you don't necessarily agree with. Maybe the company, maybe you have strong climate opinions, and maybe that company literally like runs strip mines that like as a secondary business unit, right? That maybe you find out in that 10K. So maybe you throw the brakes on right there, right? So I definitely agree with that type of prep stuff. So another thing that I do, Stefan, that is really difficult to do at very large companies, but if the company's at a reasonable size, you can use LinkedIn to find out who works in the information security department at that company and kind of get a read on who they are, and not unless to be like a creep and like, ooh, what are you into? It's more like, what's this person's background, like what looks like the pecking order, because chances are you're going to be in the interview with them, and again demonstrating your due diligence, if you will, that you're like, oh, hey, like, oh, I saw that you used to work at KPMG, like my mom works at KPMG or whatever. You know what I mean? Like there's something there that's interesting. Now, I wouldn't recommend going into like their Facebook and personal life and being like, oh, hey, your daughter is pretty cool. Like, like I wouldn't recommend that. Keep it professional. But I do think that there's some value that can be mined out of that type of approach as well.
There is, and as we stay above the OSINT creepy line, as you mentioned, um, yeah, there's a lot that you can pull in that is useful, and being able to understand what that is and then leverage that is is very important. So I once had a boss that effectively said, or so he was a boss and mentor, and he was talking about moving to the next position, and he goes, Stefan, uh, if your next boss is really into ice climbing, guess what you're going to be into?
Take a guess. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's an element of resonation there that you have to kind of go through and figure out. But there's also limits to your time. You only have so much that you can do, and you're just trying to pick those couple threads that you can potentially pull on. And then you have an idea of the company and the framework that they operate in. Their clients, their suppliers, how
Hmm.
they generate their revenue, as much as you can at least. And then from there, if you're going for a technical role, you start making some assumptions about their tech.
Hmm.
So you could also, look them up on Shodan or the equivalent, uh, you know, all-encompassing scanning tool that you're not actually scanning yourself.
Yeah.
You You could do that, or you could go out to because this is another point. Open source intelligence and sales prospecting is basically the same exact parallel pipeline for anybody that wants to know. Um, there's some sales tools out there that you can get for free, like Intricately and Owler, that give you an idea of uh, what the company spends their money on. So if they have a spend on, say, Cloudflare, then you should probably go take a look at get the fundamentals of Cloudflare, what it is, what it does, etc., and then use that as, potential bridge. So this is
Mhm.
all about like just doing your due diligence prior to then feed into what I think is kind of the next step, which is rehearsing potential questions on both the technical side and the non-technical side.
Yeah. Well, that's a great segue. So what kind of questions like all right, so now we're fully prepped, Stefan, we're walking in, we're feeling confident, we're sharp dressed. What questions are we expecting the that are going to happen regardless of what the position, what the role, what the company, all that?
So there's one question that's been around in tech forever.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Go I mean I could guess it, but go ahead.
So I think you and I have actually talked about this before, but there's that one question that is still incredibly relevant.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It's
When you
what happens when you type in a URL and hit enter.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And we've asked that a million times over. It is a great question. I'll let you go since you're the talent. Go ahead.
Yeah. So this particular one, if you think that this is a DNS question for anybody listening, it is 5% a DNS question.
Yeah.
So as you go through, and the point of this is not to go through and really show that you know everything. The point is to really drive a couple things. One, do you understand how systems work? Do you understand and are you confident enough to make assumptions? And then, at the follow on, at the end of all of it, how would you attack the model that you just described? And then how would you defend against the thing that you just proposed for an attack?
Hmm.
So, like if you're going to say you're targeting a cloud security company that only operates on AWS, and you figure that out because you did your research,
Hmm.
then as you go through and you practice this, maybe they'll never ask the question of what happens when, but you've done the work so that way as you go through that pipeline, you have a great understanding of all the different ways that that could go through, and that'll answer many technical questions on that.
Yeah.
So like what are some of the feeders into that? Operating system. Is it cloud based? Are we in a VPC? Are we on prem or colo? Is there SD-WAN involved? Uh, where can I see things? So how do I prevent, detect, respond throughout this entire big, amazingly complex assumed environment?
Hmm.
And then as you go through that journey, you're like, oh wow, I guess there's some gaps there in my knowledge that I need to go learn.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would argue too, like I agree with you 100%. That's such a age-old question. And if you're watching this and you're thinking like, well, what's the big deal? You push the button and the results come back, no big deal. And as Stefan mentioned with DNS and the OSI stack and network traversal and routing protocols and everything. I mean, it goes beyond cybersecurity, but in one question, you reveal to the interviewers your level of technical acumen, right? And maybe the position doesn't require you to be super technical, but it doesn't matter because you're basically baselining yourself depending on how you answer that question. And I mean, there is a wrong answer, obviously, but for the most part, you can you'll kind of reveal that like you had a strong networking background or you had a strong system administration background. But the one thing I will say, because you will get these kind of open-ended analytical, critical thinking kind of questions that are less. There's a right answer and a wrong answer, and it's more like I'm trying to see what you're thinking. How do you think? I will caution you and take this away from this presentation today. Always ask clarifying questions. When Stefan said you hit in a URL and hit enter, like, are you thinking in your mind you're on your own personal laptop? Are you not in a VM? Are you not in a corporate data, like in a data center? I don't know if they still do this, but like the servers that you pull a blade out and you lift it up,
They
like
still do.
where are you? Right? Yeah, like ask the clarifying questions, because the interviewer has made up a question based on nothing. And when you start asking qualifying questions, they have to start painting the picture for you. And it becomes an interesting back and forth, and get them thinking too. And if you can inspire kind of, or cause the interviewer to think something that they weren't necessarily going to think of, it's huge. It's really, really impactful, I would say.
It is, and having gone through that and been asked that question years ago, the interviewer that I had that was asking to me, uh, like you, PhD, had been doing this, like had has like RFCs into DNS, like super crazy smart guy, and he goes, I want you to understand before you answer this that my job is to figure out what the bedrock of your knowledge is, and where does that bedrock end, because that defines the depth of knowledge in each location. And we're going to get to points that you do not know, and that is totally fine
Mhm.
because that gives us a good picture. And I think from the perspective of the interviewer, I want everybody else listening to this to know that you do not have to know everything.
Yeah.
You have to know enough to get through it and know where your gaps are. And if they ask you pointed questions and you don't know, it's okay, and you should say, I don't know.
100%, 100% agree. You're not doing yourself any service if you lie. So definitely throw that out the door. But if you are just speaking to fill time instead of saying, I don't know the answer to that, the interviewer is going to be able to hear what you're saying and realize you don't know the answer. And now you're actually doing yourself a disservice instead of just saying, I don't know, because time is valuable. And let's move on to another question that we
Can I tell a story about that real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
So in a different interview, that story actually took me down to like C-level memory allocation, and like the difference between malloc and string copy and stern copy. And like we went from DNS down to actual like firmware level compilation.
Yeah, you're like a beautiful mind with like the formulas flying over your face and
The
stuff.
integral, and yeah.
Oh, that's
um,
too funny. What other question? I mean, are there any other kind of hallmark questions? I mean, clearly that's one, but are
oh
there any
yeah.
other things that you could expect to be asked?
Oh yeah. So one of my favorite things that I've seen, and this is a number of times, is like, um, you go from macro level questions to micro level questions, and you'll suddenly go back to macro, and they're, whether they mean to or not, they're usually generally the check there is that you can do context switching.
Hmm.
So you'll go from some incredibly technical rabbit hole to switching back to immediately like, what is cybersecurity?
Hmm.
Ah, but it's the thing, we protect money.
It's where we
Right.
secure the cybers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, be ready for like, what is cybersecurity? And again, nobody actually agrees on it. So when you go out and look at all the different, just go look at some of the major cybersecurity companies that are out there, whether it's one word or two words, or like, it is,
Hyphen. Yeah.
yeah, it is hilarious.
Yeah. Well, and I agree with you. I feel like another one is like, what is risk? You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like I've asked that question for a risk analyst role. I'm like, all right, so the position's risk analyst. What is risk? And they're like, it's
Probability.
yeah, and not to I'm never trying to stump them. I'm never trying to catch you off guard. But sometimes you really got to take a step back as you're doing your prep and think about what you're doing. Don't get so hyper focused on like what 0 day the exchange vuln got exploited by, and actually think about like the bigger picture. I think that's a great tip, Steph. And do you have any other like tips on how to do context switching, or to be
Literally
better at
take a
it?
breath.
Yeah, exactly.
Literally take a breath and take a second to gather your thought,
Hmm.
and then speak. Take a breath, think, speak.
Yeah. That was exactly what I was going to suggest as well. You got to remember, like, you might be anxious. It's very common to be anxious in the interview, but if you take a moment, no, like, even though it might feel like an eternity to you, it's just a moment to everybody else in the room, and it's not going to feel weird. Now, if you are stare at them for 30 seconds, that might start entering the realm of uncomfortable. But yeah, pause. Everybody knows that you're collecting your thoughts, right? So
Mhm.
I think that's a great point.
There's different purposes of each different interview, and whether you're going for a technical job or a non-technical job, there's going to be technical and non-technical interviews.
Mhm,
And you for like the super technical interviews that I'm sure you and I have both been through, sometimes the mad scientist walks in and they go up and they scribble some things down on a marker board and they say go, and then you go and they're like, yep, cool, and then they're out, and then their job was only to be there for that one thing, and then there's usually like a handler that's kind of running you through. So whether it's HR or an internal or external recruiter, or the actual hiring manager, or you might go up in front of some CEO or other chief something throughout this process as validation. Sometimes it's purely conversational, sometimes it's not. So you, your audience will literally change as you go throughout. One of the other questions that I hear all the time that's actually somehow really, really challenging within cybersecurity is, what is an APT?
mhm,
And that question again is just that little bit of the iceberg above the water, and it can completely flow out from there.
mhm,
So what is cybersecurity? What happens when you type in DNS? And what is an APT? Those are kind of the three core questions that show an amazing amount of depth of knowledge.
mhm, yeah. And I think if you prepare for those questions, even if you're not asked, it'll help. It's almost like stretching out, making sure that you're really like in the right mindset and kind of considering all these different things. And like you said, it'll shoehorn a bunch of things in there. So even if you don't get asked that question specifically, you have brought up into your kind of near term memory recollection various things that you
Mhm.
can call upon in these interviews. I agree. Um, so I guess let's just let's drill a little bit further on, right? So there's these obvious questions. Some people might be relatively new, right? And they went right into the military, now they're getting out or they're graduating, they haven't gone through this. So let's talk about what does the interview, what does it look like? Is it just you sitting down with one person? Like what's the bag of interviews that they may encounter?
So there's a slew of interviews. Yeah, so there's a slew of different types of interviews that are out there, and each company kind of has their own flow chart, whether it's either, sometimes it's codified and sometimes it's not, depending on how big they are. And you will have there are so many different types that you need to be ready for the gambit. Sometimes it's one-on-one audio, just over the phone, with like the most junior person in HR, that their job is just to check some basic things. Like, is this person somebody that by definition, by law, can work for us? That's a very not a technical question at all. Citizen of whatever state, done. Kind of as you go through the pipeline, then there's usually sometimes like a senior HR person that's doing a little bit of filtering prior to you going to the hiring manager. So that person maybe has a little bit of idea of some of the acronyms that they should ask, and they're just trying to test your confidence. Basic questions. Check, check, check. Then often it's hiring manager after that, and the hiring manager wants to know one thing: can you either do this job? If not, is it within a small time frame the ability to scale you up to do the job? And if that's the case, then if you've got a little bit of wiggle room, great. So you just have to beat out whoever else you're competing with. So it's a competition. Fine. You're a competitor, you'll do great. So that one tends to be a little bit about half and half. Half on uh, like questions, things that are about you, things that you know, and then the stories that you can tell about things that you have done. And then many times, many companies will go through and do a couple other things. Even if you're going to a purely technical role, often you will still have to go sit down with a completely non-technical role to see if they can bring if you're even compatible. Because
Hmm.
one of the biggest questions that like a chief revenue officer or a director of sales will ask is, can I put this person in front of clients? So can they?
Yeah.
Which means they have to do that test. So you've really got this breadth. Some companies call it like maybe the Big Show, or I've seen like speed dating. I've seen tons of names for this where you go and you basically sit down and you talk with either one-on-ones or two-on-ones or three-on-ones or even panels back and forth to determine fit. So
Mhm.
usually, one or two HR calls, maybe a recruiter call before that, hiring manager, and then usually a couple other people inside, and that will vary. For me, the panel interview is kind of the most interesting outlier because even though you've gone through and you've been introduced to all these people, hey, I'm Ted, I'm in IT. I'm Frank, I'm in sales. I'm Sally, I'm over here, whatever. By the time you're into like your third question of the back and forth, you might not remember who the person is that asked the question. Or so trying to frame the answer for them can be a challenge. You're like, okay, hold on. Yep, got it, got it, got it. Um, So by again, take a breath, think, pause, act is a great thing to do for the panel interview. And then um the really knowing your stories and like what makes you you is so important to this process
Mhm.
that if you haven't rehearsed that to this point, you can stumble a little bit during the questions. Like, tell me about a time that you overcame adversity. Tell me about a time that you had interpersonal conflict with your boss. Tell me about a time that you were given a massive project with a low degree of success and how you either made it succeed or what you learned from failure.
Yeah.
And if you don't know those stories, like even if you're coming out of high school, those stories they're still who you are. And if you can't talk your stories, then it'll be harder to show that you are going to compete here.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think that that also goes back to the prep phase that we talked about. And those are common questions. They're again, they're not technical questions, they're not cyber questions, but they are questions that get asked pretty regularly. And to sit there and go, oh geez, and like the thing is, like to think of like maybe a conflict with a boss, you might have one or two like memories that are fresh, not fresh, but like you don't forget them because they were so uncomfortable. But like a time you overcame adversity, like you're going to start kind of like thinking, and then not to say that it's a complete deal breaker, but you'd like to look prepared. You'd like to look capable that, like, oh, I know I got that answer. You know what I mean? And you don't have to be a great storyteller, but it does have to be relevant. And yeah, if you've thought about it, it
And
will
from the
be,
heart.
yeah, it has to be genuine. Again, don't ever lie. I can't emphasize that enough. Just as a quick aside, I actually had a candidate lie to me in a panel interview. Uh,
Oh,
she said, well, and the thing is, I'm telling you, don't lie. But if you're gonna lie, do not make it something that I can Google right then, because she did, and I did, and then I asked her. My follow up question was, "It's interesting that you said that because you didn't. So how does that work?" And she's like, "Oh, you got me." And I'm like, "Yeah, wait, we'll be called. We'll
so does anybody else have any other
yeah,
questions?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, anyways, yeah, absolutely. Those stories. I mean, do you have any tips or thoughts around how someone watching this might be able to, they might say, well, I don't get it. What do you mean have a story?
Mhm.
Like to take like the adversity one, for example, stuff. And how can
Do
someone
you wanna
find that
ask do you wanna
story?
ask me one of those questions? Pick one.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Stefan, why don't you have you ever had a situation where you had to basically push some type of cybersecurity policy or initiative forward that was not popular, and how did you succeed at getting it in place?
Absolutely. So with this is a role from a few jobs past. We had it was a government client. I'd been assigned to this government client, and they had some minimal security posture. This is a massive client, like multiple continents. And when we got there, the 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 teams that were running effectively their security posture at that point were very immature by the book. Mature people, mature organization, but the process wasn't there. And there were many questions like who's watching the watcher? Who is implementing this? How do these information flows back and forth? Who's being notified? What are the actions here? Um, and there were many answers that were just I don't know or it does not exist. And then as we engaged more stakeholders, and we had many of those solutions basically boxed and ready to go. That was our job. Um, there's many stakeholders across the organization that did not want us there. Period. Kind of the old guard mentality. If somebody's looking at our stuff, they're going to find stuff that's wrong, and if they find stuff that's wrong, I'm not going to have my job anymore. So there were enough of these stakeholders across this very large organization that we started off at our level, we escalated, and we're talking over a period of a year, literally a year. And we had small gains and small wins, but the inflection point where we were able to define that we were going to win was not actually for about a year in. And after going through with this particular organization, it took both a bottom up and a top down approach to go through and do this. So we had to go to like 4 different sections of IT, a couple different sections that call themselves cybersecurity that kind of by definition were adjacent to it. We had to go through the end client and consumer of the data to drive it kind of sideways across the organization. And it took us, like a massive approach to do all of this to the point where we literally switched tactics 5 or 6 times throughout this whole process and showing little bits and little bit of wins and telling those stories to the point that after a year, we were able to then finally launch in, and we ended up being one of the first organizations of the size across the DoD that really started to get some pretty good wins. So it took that level, and it was a long start. But by taking all the different approaches and interfacing with stakeholders and doing like this basically whole of organization approach, we were able to get there effectively ahead of our peers. So it was incredibly difficult and
Hmm.
fun and rewarding, and that organization's still doing great today.
Oh, that's fantastic. Now, just to step back and kind of analyze what you did from a story perspective, I thought that that was a fantastic answer. I hope people watching this realize that he clearly addressed the question, gave it enough detail. It ran like a true story where it had a starting challenge, uh, some adversity that the hero dealt with, and then ultimately overcame that adversity and transformed into the better situation, and then a happy ending at the end. So definitely addressed it, definitely told me that you can make big changes in big companies that require, you know um, it's not just a turnkey, it's not just a specific, add this, change this config, problem solved. It's a much bigger cultural issue, and that's fantastic, Stefan.
So thank you. And having lived through it, it was insanely challenging. Every one of those stupid little victories, even though they were so small, there was basically a party that was involved because we had a little win, and you got to celebrate the little wins too. We'll do more story time with Stefan on that one later.
Yeah.
But um, when I was going through and doing the self inventory on myself, because I try to make sure that anything that I do to the level that I can teach, and that was fundamental to me building my company and selling it. And as I'm coaching my candidates on how to do what I have done, I wanted to get deeper. And so the kind of the mental model that I used, or the framework, was okay. I needed to learn my stories. I need to learn my stories. Need to learn my stories. And I went through and I built a cue card of all the stories that I thought were good, that I thought I could
Smart.
share.
Yeah.
I was wrong.
Oh, that's too bad because it sounds like a good idea.
It well, I thought it was, and I still think it is, but I think there's a better way to do it.
Okay, share it with us.
Okay, so I stumbled on a couple different books of like interview questions, non-technical interview questions. My favorite one, I've got it right here, is High Impact Interview Questions: 701 Behavior-Based Questions to Find the Right Person for Every Job.
All right, I'll put a link in the description below for that book. Thanks, Stefan.
I need to make these guys start paying me referral fees, right? Um, so this particular one, it's more written for hiring managers than it is necessarily candidates. But if you get in their head, then you
Hmm.
win.
Yeah.
So I went through and I pulled off. Um, I started by kind of going through it and looking at the questions and thinking about how I'd answer the questions. And then, next day I started to look at them again. It's like, oh yeah, I had that story, I had that story. And so then I tried saying them out loud and started like the stories from my cue card versus the stories that I was saying out loud were not the same stories.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then I thought, okay, so what's the next level? And the, going back to the military, practice is great, but rehearsal is where you win. So I thought, okay, how do I rehearse this? Well, duh, Stefan, I sit down and I do this with somebody else.
Yeah.
And this is sometimes 3 o'clock in the morning, 'cause as a small business owner, and you don't get to you do it when you can. There's nobody else awake. So how do I? And literally, what I found was, and I've coached many people on this over the years now, of literally sit like a stuffed animal across the table from you. Like if your spouse or your friends are sick of rehearsing and they don't want to hear your voice anymore, that eye contact with something, even if it's as stupid as a teddy bear, will put you on the spot and you will change the way that you answer questions.
Interesting. Yeah, that is an interesting technique, and one that really anyone can take advantage of, because everybody's got most people have access to something that has eyes. You know,
Statement of the year.
so that is good. Another technique that just since we're kind of wrapping on it, that could be pretty interesting is turning the camera on, talking into the camera. Having done all these YouTube videos, getting camera confident is it's kind of awkward and it takes a while to get used to. But if you can record yourself talking and then you watch it back, you're going to see it from literally from the other person's perspective, and you will be hypercritical, as people are of themselves. But you can really quickly analyze yourself and be like, I don't like, obviously I don't feel comfortable right there, or like, that's a silly point. Why did I even bring that up? And I agree with you. You can start really refining and getting that kind of quiver of story arrows lined up, and you pull them out as you're ready. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the beauty about it is when you have a good corpus of questions, that's just one of them that I use, right? When you have a good corpus of questions, and you don't have to go through all 701, pick two from each category. Um, those questions that you learn, they become a rock, and you can, from any perspective, you can use those to answer almost any question. And the beauty about it is they're also your stories. You know them, you lived about them, you know when the crux is there, you know when to talk really loud, and you know when to get quiet because it was really tough and it was painful. But then you got it and you got to win. You can celebrate that in the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. That's like next level storytelling right there. That's fantastic. Definitely getting more value out of this conversation than just interview best practices, for sure. So Stefan, one other thing that I really want to talk about, I mentioned it a little while ago about how it's a two-way street, right? Like, I know you want a job, you want that job, you need that job maybe. So you don't want to not cause a problem or anything, but sometimes it's just not a good fit, right? And we
Mhm.
call these red flags. There's red flags in the interview of the company or of the hiring manager or whatever. What are some red flags that people at least should be on the lookout for or take stock of? And if they make the decision to take the job anyways because they want to or they have to or they need to, that's fine, but they're making an informed decision. So let's talk about some red flags.
The first one is if you get to physically go to a location and you're physically there and you look around and you go, does this feel like, is this a living, breathing organization that I think would be good, that I think I might like to work in?
Hmm.
There's uh there's an old hedge fund manager from years and years and years ago. We're talking like CRT TVs, like the old school TV type thing. And
Hmm.
so I don't remember his name or anything about it, but the point stuck with me. He goes, I know if a person will succeed in my business the moment they walk in and I watch them walk across the floor by how they interact.
Interesting.
And the flip side of that is, hubris aside, maybe you're right 90% of the time, maybe you're not. Um, but the flip side of that is you might know when you walk in. So when I walked into Stratacor's offices the first time, I thought they were going to be a client. And I was looking around, I was like, you know what, this would kind of be a cool place to work. And 35 minutes later, I found out they wanted to buy my company. So it was worked. It
Win,
was great.
win. Yeah,
Um,
I agree. I agree 100% with the like if your spidey sense goes off right off the rip before you've even spoke to anyone, um, that could be an indicator or something that you should listen to for sure. Yeah.
well, there's also like two two questions that I like to ask. And we'll talk about this more later, but there's two questions that I like to ask um, in almost any person that I'm talking to at the hiring company. The first one, and because they're such telling questions,
Hmm.
the first one is, why is this job open?
Hmm.
You will have a wide variety of answers. Sometimes it's, we're scaling, we need more people, it's great. Cool. Sometimes it's, well, the last guy. Okay. So what are the pitfalls that I should avoid? Well, whatever the answer is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that's that can be, that can be a fun one from kind of like the operational feeling. There's another one um, that you see people literally like take a deep breath and and Doc, I've done this. I've done this. So it's, you see the answers.
Yep.
You ask this question, literally see people go, well, they take a
Like,
breath, they say well,
get,
and they lean back in their
get up
chair.
and close the door.
And that question is, why do you love working here?
Hmm. Yeah.
And you can read it quick.
Hmm.
And surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, people tend to be very honest with that question, or at least as honest as they can be. And I've had answers everywhere from, I love it because the team is amazing. And when I sit down with them, I always learn and they push me and they progress me. And we're there for each other in a way that a sports team is. And then I've had answers from, I'm actually interviewing other places. I think this is a great company. It's just not for me right now with my career progression.
Wow, that is brutally honest. I've never had anyone say that to me in an interview. But
Multiple times.
I like what you're saying though, Steph. And I know we're going to talk about questions to ask later. But what you're basically doing is extracting potential red flags, which is
Yes.
pretty clever. I do like that.
I like passive and active, and I
Yeah,
like covert and overt.
yeah, I like it. I do like that. I'll be stealing that or appropriating that for myself. But I
You don't
will
have to
pay.
steal it, it's yours. Done.
Okay, I'll give you royalties for it. Personally, I think one of the biggest red flags, and you hear about it. I've fortunately I've never experienced it personally, but if the person interviewing you is like interrupting you or rude, uh, sometimes even like mocking you, like just ridiculing your responses or making you feel little. Like
Out. I'm
I know
done.
it sounds obvious, but again, if you're in a vulnerable position because you need the job or something like that, I'm telling you that is such a red flag because that person is already establishing who they are and what they're going to be to you from day zero. Yeah. So another one that you don't always get it, but in a panel interview, sometimes you can see the relationship among the staff with each other. And sometimes if it's like, jovial and they're cracking, they're busting on each other or whatever, they don't have to be busting on each other, but there's a certain vibe that a team will have with each other. And if that vibe is noticeably uncomfortable, that to me is a red flag also. And, it could just be that one person and they're not being rude to you directly, but they're like snipping at each other or mumbling under their breath, or, there's, or just being straight up disrespectful and rude about the actual interview, like showing up late, being just, I mean, and there's reasons to be late to interviews, of course, but it's just, I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, if the people are projecting just a bad vibe, in it could be the individual ridiculing you or it could be themselves interacting, that's something to take note of and be cognizant of as a potential red flag.
Unless you operate really well in that environment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If you operate really well in that environment, that might be the green light for you to go. That's
Yeah.
not how I operate. It's not how I like to operate. But if that's you, more power to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And definitely good point to qualify. I always do try to not speak in absolutes because, I'm not like everybody else. Um, but so let's pivot here, because I mean, obviously there's a couple red flags, but let's pivot here and um, talk about questions that you would ask, because in every interview, unless there's, it might even be a red flag if you don't get to ask questions. In every interview, at the end, you will typically be granted 15 minutes is kind of a normal amount of time. Hey, like, we've been talking to you, getting to know you, but we want to give you an opportunity to get to know us. Do you have any questions? Now, before I ask Stefan what questions he would, suggest, aside from the overt extraction, interrogation technique of pulling red flags out of people that we just
Former
talked through.
military.
Yeah, he is former military. It. One thing I would caution you, viewer, right, is don't ever say I don't have any questions. That's literally not. That's not an option. You can't say that. We'll give you some right now. Write them down. Even if you don't care about the answers, ask them. If you don't have any of questions of your own, because having no questions of your own appears to be disengaging, uninterested, just not a good sitch. So okay, so having prefaced that, Stefan, what aside from your extraction techniques, what questions do you think are good questions to ask, and why?
So there's a couple macro ones, and if this first one hasn't already been addressed or is not immediately apparent, definitely go for it. If it has been addressed, then you may not need to. But that is, how does this position contribute to revenue? And if it doesn't contribute to revenue, how does it decrease cost? Because remember, a business is out there to make money for stakeholders. So if that's the case, then we need to understand the macro level view. There's another question that I really, really love, and that is, how do you define success in this position? And if that hasn't been thought through, then you can help drive it. It may or may not be a red flag. But if it hasn't been thought through,
Yeah.
then you can drive that conversation to say, okay, well, let's sit down, let's talk about it. And I think, from my perspective, success looks like this.
Mm-hmm.
And agree or disagree, you have a conversation. And sometimes interviews actually turn into planning sessions, which is a great sign, by
Yeah.
the way.
You're already baking yourself in. I agree. I love proactivity and initiative, and for someone to help me solve one of my problems, because really, that at the end of the day, that's what you're really trying to do in an interview. You're trying to sell yourself and your services to a company under the auspices that you're there to solve their problem, whatever that problem is. Right? That's all. That's all it is. At the end of the day, that's what the job interview is. So that is a really good question, and I just want to comment on how do I contribute to revenue? That's brilliant, because people you're asking may not even have thought about how their job contributes to revenue, but it really does put it into perspective that we are here to support a business, and
Mhm.
the business people love that, especially in the cybersecurity world, because they often see us as a cost center or just nerds who are doing security, and they typically don't care about us until there's ransomware, and then they really care about us, right? So connecting to the business, I think, has a lot of value, and it shows that you're thinking bigger than just your silo.
It, y- yeah, and I will say, the the perspective of security has been changing, and especially rapidly so since we went on lockdown last year. The latest report that I saw said that by 2025, 25%, so easy to number 25 and 25, 25% of boards will have a security specific committee on it. Um, and CEOs across the number, like probably half or more of my clients are starting to ask the question about security.
Hmm.
And we that's all, like probably 3 more talks. But, yeah, that's understanding how you align with revenue or cost is great. So that question might be, let's go through a couple examples of that, or the answer
Hmm.
might be, well, we used to be on this really expensive solution and we switched to freeware, and we can buy that with you and freeware for cheaper than we could have paid solution. There's a lot that goes into that.
Hmm.
So be prepared to understand it. Like, okay, it's freeware. Do you have to compile it? So we're not going to go to the follow-on questions, but that's one of them. One of them could be, feel like you're on the compliance and auditing standpoint of, well, we want to go into a new market, and in order to go into that new market, we'll just say Europe. Um, we have to have GDPR and ISO 27001. Your job is to do that. So if you fail, we cannot enter that market and thereby not capture the revenue from that entire continent.
Hmm.
Oh, that ROI directly attributes to security, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Another great one is, what does my first 90 days look like?
Yeah. Yeah.
And how do you, like, we talk about success in the position, but what does success at the first 90 days look like?
Don't go too deep on that, Stefan, because this is just one of the videos that we're going to be covering in Security with Stefan series here on the 6 parts episode, where we're going to spend an entire session talking about the first 90 days and how to absolutely crush it. So, yeah, so look for that. It'll be in the playlist or a card up in there. Yeah, there'll be a card there. Yeah.
There's cards somewhere
Yeah,
around
there's
here.
cards everywhere. Yeah. So, but yeah, absolutely. Yeah. First 90 days. Set yourself up for success because you can mentally prepare and align expectations.
Mhm. Another one, and this again gets directly back to kind of red flags, is, what do you think my biggest frustration will be?
Hmm.
And that answer might be business, it might be people, it might be process, it might be technology, it could be a number of different things. And then once, if you've done the good self inventory of knowing who you are and what is frustrating, and that really aligns, and that actually might be might be the straw that breaks the camel's back.
Hmm.
Good to know. Or it might go, oh yeah, that actually doesn't frustrate me. Fine, all day long, bring it. Um, then if we kind of go back and look at the question of, what am I going to get out of this? Because we already know that you're going to extract as much value out of me as possible to make money for your stakeholders.
Hmm.
If you do have a uh, equity plan, then you're one of the stakeholders. So good job, you get it from both sides. Um, those questions kind of being, how long until promotion opportunities?
Hmm.
What do I need to do? Like, so we talked about success, but what do I need to do to be successful at the next level, and then unlock that next level?
Hmm.
And then also, that's going up. What about going to the side? What types of broadening opportunities might I need? So I talked with a gentleman earlier today that is a CEO of a fairly cool company that goes through and does like secured elite software, that amazing stuff. And he was at his company for 10 years and then left for 2. So he started off at the help desk, moved up, went into sales. I know, crazy, right? Like I did. Oh boy,
Yep.
we're the worst. Went into sales, left, went to another company, and then they brought him back as the CEO. So in order to go be a CEO and advance ahead of his peers, he actually had to leave the company
Yeah.
for broadening. So that's, is the company big enough for that? And I think that, as you're interviewing, uh, going back to your original thesis, is, do you want to work there or not? And I can tell you that I've interviewed with a number of places, and there's ego and pride, obviously. But I've interviewed with a number of places that I sit in and I go, "Do you have any questions?" I do, and I'll ask a couple because I don't want to burn any bridges, and I am generally interested, generally. Um, but I'm not really interested, and I'll push the button to hire and sign if I need to,
Hmm.
but "Yeah, I really can't see myself for more like I'll be bored after 6 months, or I'll be whatever after 6 months. Frustrated,
Yeah,
confused, lost, directed, tired,
uninspired. Yeah.
uninspired, tired and uninspired."
Yeah, and I this is actually a good time to kind of inject this for a minute. Just if people are in a situation where they're working with a recruiter, if be true to yourself. If that job is not a good fit for you, then don't take it. And I just want you to know a reality that you may not encounter unless you lived it once or twice. But like I've been in a position before where I didn't want the job and I said I don't want the job. And basically the recruiter did everything to get me there and I didn't want the job, which basically means the recruiter doesn't get their piece of the pie. And this recruiter was incredibly upset, infuriated with me. So that's something I had to deal with. And I'm like, oh, what do you think? I'm going to take the job now? Like, I'm not taking the job and I'm not going to take it because you're berating me. Like, thank you. And also, I'm quite sure I won't be working with you ever again. So just, be true to yourself, right? Don't put yourself in a bad situation unless you don't have a choice, right? Which is, that's a different situation
And just to be
altogether.
clear for anybody that's listening, I was not that recruiter that
Yeah,
Jerry
Stefan
was
was not that
talking
recruiter. Yeah, no, Stefan Semaroth, friend of the show. Yes.
about.
So I do feel compelled to share my one. Like I have one. I love the questions you gave, Stefan, and I think that they're just like stock. People should document them and keep them in their holster at all times. The one question that I came across in my travels that I just love, and I do ask it, is what is it about this place that I wouldn't find anywhere else? What, like culturally, whatever, like what is it that you guys are about or doing that is unique to you? And it's really interesting because you typically get like whatever point of pride they have, but by eliciting that, you understand what is important to them and what they're proud of. And sometimes it's really interesting and really cool, and sometimes it's not, and it's like, ooh, okay, so but I think that that's a fantastic question, and people love talking about themselves, and people love talking about things that they're into. So a question like that typically allows someone, they're very comfortable and they get an opportunity to kind of like brag on something. So I've always found that to be a useful question because the person wants to answer it, and B, you get some valuable intel out of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I love extracting whenever possible.
Yes, exactly. So, all right. So we just gave you a whole host of questions that you can ask, right, at the end of the interview and why you should ask them. But what there's questions you should not ask. Okay. Like, and there's some obvious ones like I can't even believe I have to say this, but I feel in 2021 I have to say this. Like, don't ask the interviewer if they're single or anything around that. Like, I see these stories and I'm like, oh my god. So keep it professional. That's the disclaimer here. But Stefan, what questions should you not ask about in the interview?
Oh, I mean, I could go with the standard response of illegal, immoral, or unethical.
Hmm.
Um, I think the better answer, though, for most people that that abide kind of by general regulations and
Yeah.
customs and courtesies here in the states, is making sure that you tailor your questions to the audience and the person that's on the other side of the table. So if it is
Good point.
somebody that's in HR, don't ask them a question about how they detect bad on their network. And vice, on the other side, if you're talking to the hiring manager, often the hiring manager only has some input into pay. So you can talk to them about, you know, may you talk to them about maybe like, is this pay structure competitive? Not what will the pay structure be?
Yeah.
And I think that's an important differentiator because it's important to know that because you want them to feel good about themselves as well, and you don't want to sharpshoot them, which gets us into even more stuff of don't be a jerk.
Hmm.
So if the question is this, lay down an appropriate response. You don't have to go through and show an exhaustive, full on understanding to the point where you're just showing that you know everything.
Hmm.
Um, and we're talking about we're kind of talking about hard skills and what had been referred to as soft skills that Simon Sinek calls human skills now. And I think that that's another good differentiation. If you just be a good human, like there you go. Learn some of those fundamentals. And if you're on the extrovert side, you're like, yeah, Stefan, no duh, it'd be good. But we're in cybersecurity, which means most people are introverts. So we'll go ahead and say what it should be obvious.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. And I love that you qualified, like really understanding who you're speaking to. You don't have to fully understand how to do HR's job or whatever, but understanding like the buckets of questions that you should be asking. And again, like you're not just asking for the sake of asking, right? You're asking to get clarification and understanding. But for the questions that you just want to avoid because they're more like landmines than anything else. And I agree with you. I think the number one is, what's this pay? And like that is not an inappropriate question if it's done at the right time, and I agree, like, oh, what's the pay band? Like that, but if you're asking a peer what's the salary, like that's it gets really uncomfortable and awkward and stuff like that. I don't think it's going to nuke anything, but you just got to be careful when it comes to it. So,
And some company cultures is totally fine. Totally fine. Yeah, I'm coming in as a IC3, individual contributor 3. What are you? Oh, I'm an IC5. Wow, how did you get that? And those salaries are posted,
yeah,
which you could talk about that. But sometimes it's a little more frustrating. And can I share a quick story about
yeah, please.
okay. So early on, when I was building my recruiting company, I had this gal that was going to be perfect for a role. And I reached out and I said, "Hey, could we sit down and have a discussion on this role? I think you'd be a great fit for it." And her response was very simply, "Can you pay this much?" And I said, "Let me check. That's out of the thing." So I checked and I said no. And she said, "Well, thank you. I'm willing to consider if that is my pay floor." That took me 3 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And that was wonderful
Yeah,
to disqualify her from that role. She didn't waste my time. I didn't waste her time. So there are times when it is appropriate,
right.
as you mentioned. And if you can get to know quickly, fail fast, more power to you. Love it.
Yeah, I feel like I do love that. So I'm not saying money is a taboo topic that you can't talk about, but I
Right on.
think asking the question like explicitly, like, what's it pay? What's this pay? Or, do I have to come in on weekends if there's an incident? Like, something like that for certain roles, right? I think it's really about framing it, right? It's all about having a higher emotional quotient and kind of framing it like, oh, hey, if there was a cyber incident over a holiday, what's the typical kind of response plan for that? I mean, do you guys have a third party? Is it all hands on deck, or do we take rotation? Like, you're basically getting the answer to, do I have to come in on the weekend? But you're not saying it like someone who it doesn't want to come in on the weekend and that's not going to work for you, So, all right. Okay. So let's wrap it up, Stefan. So, what are your final thoughts around completing the interview, maybe post interview, best practices or things that you would be doing yourself if you were going through the interview process?
Follow up. Follow up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I've not always been the best at myself. Full truth in lending. Sometimes I forget to follow up.
Mm-hmm.
But just even just a quick note on LinkedIn or a quick email as a thank you does legitimately go a long way. And even especially now, ain't nobody writing letters anymore. So if
Right.
you take the time to write a letter and address it, and the next question is, where do you send it? The company headquarters. Just send it to the company headquarters in care of person.
Oh, you're talking
Uh,
about writing a physical letter?
Physical letter,
Oh
like
my
with a
gosh.
stamp.
That's old school, man.
Yeah, you pick up a thing. Oh, wow. I got a letter. Instant memorabilia.
Yeah. It is a power move. It is a power move. I would also I might do that the next time I interview somewhere. I'm probably not moving for a while, but Another thing that I think is a best practice, it has a lot of sticking power in my experience, is if for whatever reason something came up in the interview where like it was discussed like, oh, there was this talk at DEF CON in 2019 about such and such. Oh, really? That is interesting. I'll have to check that out. Like actually check it out and then include just a statement about like, oh, thanks for telling me about that Patrick Wardle talk. Like Fruit Fly really is a crazy Mac OS malware. And thanks for the interview, et cetera. Right. So like, I guess be memorable, but also like show that it wasn't just a farce. You were genuinely interested, right?
Absolutely. And there's for anybody that we've talked about how OSINT and sales fundamentals go very well together, for prospecting. Following up and going through the interview process, uh, social engineering turns out is really great for that as well. So, like,
Yeah.
these are social engineering and sales fundamentals, which again tie later in the sales process. So, all the work that you're doing now, if you want to go switch over to the dark side like me and do sales down the road, totally an option because you're getting the fundamentals. You could even go read a sales book.
I hope you're able to use these interview tips in your next interview to help you get that job and feel comfortable about what you're doing as you're moving forward. Now, if you didn't check out the other episodes in the show, you can get episode 1 right here on how to find the job and episode 2 right here on getting that resume really tight. Okay, stay tuned. Again, subscribe if you want to get episodes 4, 5, and 6 pushed to you immediately. And I hope you enjoy it. Take care.